Let's welcome back then Peter Oborne, who's with us on the programme to have a look through the big political stories of the day. Top journalist, regular on TV, written loads of books, an all-round good bloke. There you go, Peter. Stick that on a business card.
That's very, very generous. And I noticed that you're the voice of common sense, and I'll be holding you to that in our discussion this afternoon.
Well, indeed. Well, let's start with your former colleague, Boris Johnson. Without going over everything here, can we just remind everybody, you and Mr Johnson worked together for some time a while back. Was that at the Telegraph or the Spectator, or was it a bit of both?
No, when he was the editor of the Spectator, he hired me as his political correspondent.
Right.
And I have to say, he was a wonderful editor of the Spectator. This is 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And he was a joy to work for.
What happened?
Well, he went off. He then set off in another direction and became Prime Minister, you may have noticed. And I continued along my grubby path in journalism.
Well, a noble path, I should say, Peter. But how did your opinion about it? I'm not deliberately trying to be...
Yeah, no,
I'm just intrigued to remind ourselves of how we got to this position where this man you respected, I remember you've said previously, huge intellect, all of that, and then suddenly you really don't rate this guy.
Well, what was very distressing to me, because I think that integrity matters in every sphere of life, but perhaps most of all in public life, but Boris, unfortunately, started telling one whopper after another. He became a sort of compulsive lie. He lied his way into the premiership. He lied his way into the 2019 election. I was so appalled by this. I was so upset, really, by what he was doing that I opened a website recording these lies. And I calculate he lied more than 80 times as Prime Minister on the floor of, or misled Parliament, to use the proper...
But were they lies, or were they just things you disagreed with?
No, they were. I was very careful about the way I... No, they weren't just things I disagreed with.
I mean, he was voted in, he got a big majority. You say he lied to become Prime Minister, but what did he lie about?
Let me just think. Everything from the sort of... in the Brexit debate, from, the 350 million for the... a week for the National Health Service, to this notion of 40 new hospitals. I mean, there are so many of them, actually. The vaccines were depending on the vaccines, which rather marvellously were produced by his government, but they weren't stopped. He claimed they were stopped. They would have been stopped by the European Union, which was absolutely another lie. In all, there were about 80 of them. Right. It was quite a major problem, because rather than confronting situations in a serious way and looking at the difficult truths, he just makes stuff up. I remember there was a bridge between Scotland and Ireland. I mean, it went on and on and on. And it disgraced him. And eventually, of course, these lies brought him down, because he did systemically lie. Eventually, the reason he ceased to be Prime Minister was he made a lie about his certain dealings with one of his ministers, and the letter was written from the former head of the Foreign Office, saying, no, Mr Johnson, what he's saying here is untrue. And because he'd lied so many times, the fact that this very senior and respected official went on the record and said that Mr Johnson had been telling an untruth, eventually the Tory party turned on him and kicked him out. And he was the first ever British Prime Minister to leave office in disgrace.
Would you go for a drink with him today, Peter?
No, I wouldn't be able to, because I always think about Boris that he had the most enormous abilities. I saw them at first hand. And if you've been given enormous talents, you can use them for good or you can use them for ill. And the tragedy of Boris is that he used them for ill.
Well, today, he's obviously flogging a book, so that's at the backdrop of anything he's saying over the recent weeks and the last few days, etc. Last night, he flagged the idea of another referendum, like we need one of those. But this was on the membership of the ECHR, and we should put it to the people, was his suggestion. Good idea or bad idea?
I wrote with one of Mr Johnson's colleagues, Jesse Norman, a pamphlet saying that, in defending the Human Rights Act, that the European Court of Human Rights is a wonderful thing. It protects all kinds of freedoms, including conservative freedoms like the right to property, the right to free speech. and so forth. Of course, you can imagine the referendum which would happen, full of yet more of Mr. Johnson's lies, of course, and it wouldn't be a way to debate this very great issue, because human rights are wonderful things. They protect private property, which belongs to rich people, but they also protect the most vulnerable people, migrants, immigrants, the poor, and they are things which were established in the wake of World War II, in the wake of the Nazis and totalitarianism, which targeted and destroyed so many lives in 39 to 45. And they were set up, the European Court of Human Rights was set up in the wake of that, drafted by a conservative minister, approved of by Winston Churchill. And for Boris Johnson and the current Bob Jenrick, the current front runner to be the Conservative Party leader, wants to trash that wonderful inheritance from Winston Churchill. And of course, it would be a terrible thing to do.
But isn't the kind of crass reality that, yes, post World War II, 1950, this bill comes in, people had seen the most horrendous things happen, people displaced, people escaping tyranny, death, concentration camps, goodness knows what else. Of course that made sense. Today, a couple of characters paying $3,000 to float over on a boat because they want a better life might be something I would do if I lived in Eritrea or Iran. Not quite the same thing, though, is it?
That is one of the areas where it is claimed that the European human rights is being abused. And I don't think there's any evidence that Britain's membership of the ECHR makes that worse. Or what I think the government should do is arrange for people fleeing persecution who come to this country should be treated fairly. They should probably, and the French are, I understand, ready to do this, there should be a reception centre somewhere in northern France where their claims can be dealt with in a proper way, rather than creating a mess and turning it into some kind of culture war, which is what the Conservatives are doing at the moment. I agree with you, there is a crisis of migration, much of it created by our own our own
Indeed.
Foreign wars. But I don't think that abolishing the ECHR would be the answer to that.
What I find interesting, just a final point on Boris raising this point, I don't, you might be able to embroider on this a little more, Peter. I don't for one second believe that Boris Johnson believes in leaving the ECHR, no more than I believe that he was a genuine Brexiteer.
Yes, I think that's... You never really know. None of us has the right to look into the mind or the heart of another individual. And yes, you do notice that Mr. Johnson's come up with this notion as he produces this book. And there's something about this book. It's a bit too soon. Remember when Thatcher's book was published? Maggie Thatcher, or even Tony Blair's for that matter. They had real serious things to say, records of how they governed our country, massive public events. And this is really some sort of schmooze fest on behalf of Mr. Johnson. I think it's one of the many ways in which he's failed to respect our country. And can I say one last thing about him?
Yeah, please do.
I find most... you may remember that his government lied to the Queen, the late Her Majesty, about prorogation of Parliament, which I thought the disrespect shown to the Queen. And Michael Gove, we will remember that. He so distressing. He had a private conversation on Privy Council terms with Her Majesty, the late Queen, and leaked it to the front page of The Sun. And that kind of disrespect. And now, Mr. Johnson, who was the Queen's, constitutionally her advisor, but that was constitutionally his primary task, leaks certain details about her health, which have never come into the public domain before. What right does he have to do that, which he had given on such a privileged basis? And I don't think he does. I think he's debased. He's brought shame on himself.
Sorry, Peter, is there any evidence that he leaked private health details of the Queen?
Yeah, well, it's in the book. We didn't know why how she died. We didn't know about. I'm not going to say.
Oh, I see. So you're saying it's in the book. That I thought
It's
you
in the
meant
book.
something that happened prior to that. Okay.
And I just think it's rotten behaviour. You should be respectful of your relationship with the late Queen, and the way that all of Mr. Johnson's predecessors were. To sort of chuck this stuff into his book, maybe to sell a few more copies, shows such a lack of respect for for his job, but also for her and her family.
Okay.